Hello friends, welcome to Instrumentation for You channel. Today in this video we will see what is the band set, how to adjust the band set and what is the important about this band set. So let's first we see what is the band set. The band set of the control valve is the pressure range that required to stroke the valve from the beginning of the actuator to the valve rated travel. The pressure that the instrument air pressure initially takes to move the actuator stem against the actuator spring and the pressure that the actuator takes to complete a full stroke means the rated travel, and this pressure range is called the band set. In other words, the band set of the control valve is the pressure range that required to stroke the valve from the fully open position to fully closed position in a direct acting actuator, or from fully closed position to fully open position in a reverse acting actuator. For air to open valves, the lower band set value determines the available amount of seat load force, and this lower band set also determines the initial pressure required to begin the valve opening travel. And for air to close valves, the lower band set value determines the initial pressure required to begin the valve closing travel, and upper band set value represents seating force. If we define the band set, then the band set is defined as the band set is the calibration technique of the actuator spring range of a control valve to account for the in-service process force. This is the technique for calibrating the actuator spring range of the control valve by considering the process force, in which we will compress the actuator spring with spring adjuster. Then on this initial compression of the spring, we can adjust the band set of the actuator of the control valve. If the initial compression of the actuator spring is less, then the band set pressure value will be less. But if the initial compression of the actuator spring range is higher, then the band set pressure range value will also be higher. So this means that by setting the initial compression of this actuator spring, we can set the desired band set pressure range. The band set pressure range is established with the assumption that there is no packing frictions. The band set range accurate adjustment is made before connecting the actuator to the valve assembly. For example, consider that we have an air to open actuator with a 6 to 30 psi band set. Here the 6 psi is the lower band set pressure value and the 30 psi is the upper band set pressure value. So as I further explained that in air to open valves, the lower band set value represents the available amount of seat load force, and the lower band set also represents the initial required pressure of the valve to be open. So as soon as the actuator diaphragm pressure increases by the 6 psi, the actuator will move upward side, and as soon as the actuator air pressure signal reaches 30 psi, the actuator also reaches its full travel distance, and the same effect can be seen in the air to close actuator. In air to close valve, as the actuator diaphragm pressure increases up to 6 psi, the actuator will start to move downward side. As soon as the actuator air pressure signal reaches 30 psi, the actuator reaches its full travel distance. Here the actuator spring loading is to be set in such a way that when the actuator is connected to the valve and the valve is installed in the pipeline in which the process pressure is available, then through the actuator, the valve stem, plug and seat ring counter the process pressure. To do this, a sufficient amount of force is applied, and this force will hold the valve plug against the seat ring with enough seat loading to provide a specified tight setup. Let's now see how to adjust the band set. Consider that the actuator is a direct acting, and if we look at the nameplate of the actuator, we will see the band set range value of that actuator. Here the band set range value of the actuator is 6 to 30 psi and the actuator valve rated travel is 1.5 inches. To easily adjust the band set of an actuator means to easily adjust the initial compression of the actuator spring, the actuator is separated from the valve and valve stem and fixing it on the bench. To adjust the band set, we need a temporary air loading pressure and standard pressure gauge, which measures the lower band set pressure range value to upper band set range pressure value. Here, in our case, this pressure gauge should measure the 6 to 30 psi pressure, and this pressure range value is also marked on the nameplate of the actuator. Ensure that the actuator stem is at the top end of its travel before adjusting the band set. Then the diaphragm pressure will be set to 0 psi. Then gradually increase the actuator diaphragm pressure to lower band set pressure value 6 psi. And after that, check the first initial motion of the actuator stem. If the initial motion of the actuator stem is at the higher pressure value than the lower band set pressure value, Then using spring adjuster reduce the actuator spring compression. And if the initial motion of the actuator stem is at the lower pressure value than the lower band set pressure value, then using the spring adjuster increase actuator spring compression. And this spring compression will keep setting until the actuator starts moving from the lower band set pressure value 6 psi. Now actuator diaphragm air loading pressure will increase up to the upper band set loading pressure 30 psi. This pressure will expand the actuator stem toward the valve. Here note that the actuator stem and the valve stem is decoupled, and when the actuator stem moves toward the valve stem, then the actuator stem can be slide over the valve stem. The end of the actuator stem will mark on the valve stem. Now slowly, applied air loading diaphragm pressure will reduce to the lower band set pressure range value 6 psi. Then the distance between the mark on the valve stem and the end of the actuator stem will be measured, and this distance should be equal to the valve rated travel. If this distance is not equal to the rated travel, then the spring may be damaged or the actuator will have a wrong spring. Band set is very important parameter for a control valve because it establishes the seating force of a plug against the seat when the valve is fully closed. Here the actuator spring compression is set such a way when the control valve is installed in the pipeline with the process pressure applied, there is enough force applied by the actuator to the valve stem, plug and seat ring to counter the process pressure and hold the valve plug against the seat ring with enough seat loading to provide the specified tight shutoff. Subscribe my channel and press the bell icon so you can see my videos first.